Unbind her. Now. The command came sharp and cold, cutting through the oppressive din of the slave market. Heads turned toward the human, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hostility. Eryon Fallos stood motionless, his hands steady at his sides. His calm exterior masked the volatile calculation brewing within him. The chamber reeked of decay and desperation. Stale air clung to the damp stone walls, and the cries of the enslaved mingled with the guttural voices of alien traders bartering over their victims. Shackles scraped against rusted metal as captives were dragged into line, their every movement a symphony of suffering. At the center of the room, illuminated by a harsh crimson glow, was the reason Eryon had infiltrated this wretched place: Liriel Xovrin. The alien queen was a shadow of her former self, her regal bearing diminished but not extinguished. Her silver-tinted skin bore faint scars, evidence of years spent in captivity. A thick iron collar wrapped around her neck, tethered to a post like a beast meant for show. Her once proud gaze now flickered with distrust and defiance, her violet eyes sharp as fractured glass. One of the traders, a towering alien with skin like cracked basalt, snorted at Eryon's demand. "She's not for sale, human," he growled, his voice a gravelly rumble. His black eyes glinted with malice as he gestured toward Liriel with one clawed hand. "This one is special, rare bloodline, worth more than you can offer." Eryon's expression didn't waver. "I'm not here to haggle," he said evenly, his voice steady yet dangerous. "You'll release her, or I'll make this very unpleasant for everyone in this room." The trader laughed, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber. The other slavers joined in, their jeers echoing off the walls. Liriel's gaze shifted toward Eryon, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She had seen countless would-be saviors fall before her captors. What made this human any different? Eryon's hand moved to the small device clipped to his belt, a modified plasma disruptor. Its sleek black design hummed faintly as his fingers grazed the controls. The laughter around him faltered as the slavers realized the human wasn't bluffing. "You'll find that I'm not in the mood for games," Eryon said, his tone as sharp as the blade strapped to his thigh. "Release her, or test me." The basalt-skinned trader hesitated, his gaze flicking to his comrades. One of them, a wiry creature with insect-like mandibles, muttered something in their guttural tongue. Whatever the words, they carried a warning. "Fine!" the trader spat, his voice dripping with disdain. He reached for a control panel mounted on the wall, his claws clicking against the cracked surface. With a hiss, the magnetic locks on Liriel's shackles disengaged. The chains fell away with a clang, and Liriel staggered forward, her legs trembling from the sudden release. She caught herself before hitting the ground, her fingers curling into fists as she steadied her balance. Eryon stepped toward her, his movements deliberate. He offered her his hand, but she ignored it, her eyes blazing with pride. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice low and hoarse, as though it had gone unused for far too long. "Noted," Eryon replied, his tone neutral. He turned back to the traders, his posture tense. "If any of you follow us, you won't live to regret it." The threat hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. No one moved as Eryon guided Liriel toward the exit, his steps steady and his senses on high alert. The cold night air outside was a welcome change, though it carried the acrid tang of industrial fumes. The stars above were obscured by smog, their faint light struggling to penetrate the darkness. Liriel inhaled deeply as though trying to remember what freedom felt like. "You've made a mistake," she said after a long silence, her voice cutting through the stillness. "They won't let this go. They'll hunt us." Eryon glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Let them try," he said simply. Liriel studied him, her gaze sharp and untrusting. "Why would a human risk their life for me? You don't know who I am." "You're wrong about that," Eryon said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I know exactly who you are, Queen Liriel Xovrin, and I didn't come here to save you. I came here because we need you." Her breath caught, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. "Need me for what?" To end this war, Eryon replied. Before she could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from behind them. Eryon's hand flew to the disruptor on his belt as he spun around, his eyes scanning the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, a young alien, his gangly frame wrapped in tattered robes. His wide, luminescent eyes darted nervously between Eryon and Liriel. "Wait!" the boy cried, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I mean no harm!" Eryon's grip on the disruptor didn't loosen. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Girath," the boy stammered, his voice quivering. "I was a servant in the market. I overheard the traders. They've sent a signal to Vorrak Dezhrin. He knows she's been taken." At the mention of the name, Liriel's expression hardened. "Vorrak!" she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Who's Vorrak?" Eryon asked, his tone sharp. "The warlord who betrayed my people," Liriel said, her hands balling into fists. "If he knows I'm free, he won't stop until I'm captured. Or dead." Girath hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting pursuit. "He'll send his forces here. You must leave, now." Eryon lowered the disruptor, his mind racing. "Fine, you're coming with us," he said to Girath. "What? You know too much," Eryon cut him off, his voice firm. "And you clearly don't want to stay here. So unless you'd prefer to explain this conversation to Vorrak's soldiers, I suggest you move." Girath hesitated for only a moment before nodding, his face pale. "This way," Eryon said, leading them toward a hidden path that wound through the outskirts of the city. The shadows seemed to press closer as they moved, the distant sounds of pursuit growing louder with each step. Liriel glanced at Eryon, her expression unreadable. For the first time she wondered if this human might be more than what he seemed. The sharp chill of the night clung to them as they moved swiftly through the labyrinthine alleys of the city's outskirts. The buildings, rusted spires of a civilization long past its prime, loomed over them like silent sentinels. The air carried a metallic tang, and the distant roar of transport drones thrummed like restless predators hunting in the dark. Eryon led the way, his steps deliberate yet swift, his hand resting on the disruptor clipped to his belt. Behind him, Liriel kept pace with surprising steadiness, though her sharp, defiant gaze constantly swept their surroundings. Girath stumbled as he followed, his bare feet scuffing against the uneven ground, but fear kept him moving. "Faster," Eryon muttered, his voice low but firm. "They'll have trackers in the air by now." Liriel's head turned sharply at the sound of distant shouting, a chaotic blend of guttural alien commands and heavy boots echoing against metal. She inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring, as if trying to absorb every detail of their pursuers. Her voice, low and bitter, broke the silence between them. "You've endangered yourself for nothing. They won't stop until they drag us back in chains, or worse." Eryon glanced at her, his expression unyielding. "Let them come. They'll learn the hard way." "You think bravery will save you, or is it arrogance?" Liriel's voice carried a sharp edge, but her tone betrayed something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. "It's called strategy," Eryon shot back, "but if you'd rather go back, be my guest." Liriel's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The silence stretched taut between them as they moved deeper into the city's underbelly. The path narrowed, forcing them to pass beneath a low archway that dripped with condensation. The faint trickle of water mixed with the distant clatter of machinery. The air here was damp and stale, carrying the faint, bitter tang of rust and decay. Girath's voice, shaky but urgent, cut through the oppressive quiet. "They'll send the Seekers next. We won't outrun them." Eryon slowed, turning his piercing gaze on the boy. "What are Seekers?" Girath hesitated, his luminescent eyes wide. "They're machines. Small, fast. They don't stop until they've locked onto their target. And they're armed." Eryon's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities. The narrow alleys would work in their favor, limited sightlines, tight spaces. But it also meant nowhere to run if they were cornered. He glanced at Liriel, her expression unreadable, then back at Girath. "How much time do we have?" The boy hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. Not long. Eryon's hand moved to the device strapped to his wrist. The laser plasma display flickered to life, casting a faint glow over his face. A schematic of the city's layout appeared, marked with potential exit routes. His eyes scanned the display, searching for the quickest path to the Aegis Dawn. "We need to reach the ship before they close the perimeter," he said, his tone clipped. "Stay close and don't stop for anything." They pressed on, the narrow alleys giving way to a wider industrial district. Massive cranes loomed overhead, their skeletal frames creaking in the faint wind. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal, and the ground was littered with discarded machinery, jagged edges glinting like the teeth of long-forgotten predators. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine pierced the air, sharp and mechanical. Girath froze, his breath hitching. "They're here." Eryon didn't hesitate. "Move!" The group broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the metal ground. The sound of the Seekers grew louder, a menacing chorus of whirs and clicks that echoed like a swarm of locusts. Liriel glanced over her shoulder and caught sight of the machines, sleek, insect-like constructs with segmented bodies that glinted under the faint light. Their eyes burned a sickly green, and their movements were unnervingly precise, skittering over walls and ceilings with unnatural speed. Eryon pulled the disruptor from his belt, his grip firm. "Get to the ship!" he barked. "I'll slow them down." Liriel stopped in her tracks, her gaze locking onto his. "You can't fight them alone." "Keep moving!" Eryon snapped, his voice leaving no room for argument. Liriel hesitated for a heartbeat, her fists clenching at her sides. Then, with a growl of frustration, she grabbed Girath's arm and pulled him forward. "Run!" Eryon turned to face the approaching Seekers, his disruptor whirring to life. The first machine lunged at him, its razor-sharp limbs slicing through the air. He sidestepped, firing a precise shot that struck the Seeker's core. The machine erupted in a burst of sparks, its lifeless body collapsing to the ground. But more were coming. The second Seeker launched itself from a wall, its claws extended toward Eryon's throat. He dropped to one knee, firing upward. The disruptor's beam sliced through the machine, severing it in two. "Any time now, Fallos," he muttered to himself, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ahead, Liriel and Girath reached the entrance to the hangar where the Aegis Dawn was docked. The ship's sleek, angular frame stood ready, its matte black surface blending into the shadows. The gangway lowered as they approached, a faint blue glow emanating from its base. Girath hesitated at the foot of the gangway, his chest heaving. "What about him?" Liriel turned, her gaze scanning the darkness for any sign of Eryon. Her nails dug into her palms as doubt clawed at her mind. She had seen too many fall, too many promises broken. But something about Eryon's unwavering determination made her pause. "Get inside," she ordered, her voice firm. Girath hesitated, then obeyed, disappearing into the ship. Liriel's eyes narrowed as she spotted movement in the distance. Eryon emerged from the shadows, his disruptor smoking. Behind him, the shattered remains of several Seekers littered the ground, their green eyes dim. He reached her, his breathing ragged but controlled. "Told you I'd handle it," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Liriel raised an eyebrow, her tone dry. "You look like you barely survived." Eryon didn't reply. Instead, he gestured toward the ship. "Get on board. We're not out of this yet." As they ascended the gangway, the faint sound of reinforcements echoed in the distance. Liriel glanced at Eryon, her voice quiet but steady. "This isn't over." Eryon met her gaze, his expression unreadable. It's just beginning." Inside the Aegis Dawn, the atmosphere was tense but charged with purpose. The ship's heads-up displays flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the cockpit. Eryon took the pilot's seat, his hands moving with practiced efficiency over the controls. Liriel stood behind him, her gaze fixed on the starfield beyond the viewport. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of something she had long thought lost: freedom. But the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her shoulders, a reminder that this was only the first step in a much larger battle, and somewhere out there, Vorrak Dezhrin was waiting. The Aegis dawn sliced through the void, its engines emitting a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated faintly through the ship's hull. In the cockpit, Eryon's fingers moved deftly across the heads-up display, the blue-tinged light casting sharp shadows over his face. Behind him, Liriel stood silently, her eyes fixed on the swirling cascade of distant stars beyond the viewport. Her gaze was distant, her thoughts even further. "Coordinates locked," Eryon muttered, breaking the heavy silence. "We'll reach the outpost in 4 hours." Liriel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she traced the faint scars on her wrists, remnants of chains long gone but never forgotten. Finally, she spoke, her tone edged with suspicion. "This outpost of yours, how secure is it?" "Secure enough," Eryon replied without looking at her. "It's buried under a canyon on a dead planet. No prying eyes, no patrols." Liriel narrowed her gaze. "And yet you seem far too comfortable being hunted. What exactly are you hiding, human?" Eryon paused, his jaw tightening. He turned his chair to face her, his gray eyes meeting hers with a steady intensity. "I'm hiding the same thing you are. Survival. You think I enjoy being chased through half the galaxy? You're not the only one who's lost everything to Vorrak's empire." Her expression flickered, the faintest hint of regret tugging at her features. But she didn't let it linger. "Then you know this will never stop. Not until they've burned everything we care about to ash. That's why we fight," Eryon said simply. Before she could respond, the soft chime of an alert drew their attention to the display. A red marker blinked on the tactical map, its shape jagged and ominous. "We've got company," Eryon said, his voice suddenly sharp. Liriel stepped closer, her eyes narrowing at the display. A small fleet of ships had entered the scanner's range, their sleek profiles unmistakably imperial. "They're closing fast," Eryon continued, his fingers dancing over the controls. "Too fast to be a patrol. Someone tipped them off." Jirith stumbled into the cockpit, his wide eyes darting between Eryon and Liriel. "What's happening?" "Trouble," Eryon said tersely. "Get to the aft bay and strap in." Jirith hesitated, his gaze flickering to Liriel as if seeking reassurance. She gave him a small nod, her voice steady. "Go. We'll handle this." As Jirith disappeared down the corridor, Eryon activated the ship's countermeasures. Panels along the hull shifted, revealing concealed turrets that hummed to life. The ship's defensive system sprang into action, filling the cockpit with a low hum of energy. "Can this rust bucket take on a fleet?" Liriel asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Eryon smirked faintly, his hands gripping the controls. "It's not about taking them on, it's about staying alive." The first enemy volley came without warning, streaks of red plasma cutting through the black like burning needles. Eryon banked hard to the right, the ship groaning under the sudden strain. "Hold on!" he shouted as he threw the Aegis Dawn into a sharp dive. The ship's maneuvering thrusters flared, sending them plunging toward a nearby asteroid field. Liriel gripped the back of his chair, her balance steady despite the violent jolts. Her voice was calm, but urgent. "You're heading into a death trap." "Exactly," Eryon said, his smirk returning. "It's easier to lose them in the chaos." The asteroid field loomed ahead, a tangled mass of jagged rocks tumbling through space. Eryon guided the ship into the thick of it, weaving between the massive boulders with calculated precision. The Imperial ships followed, their sleek forms darting through the field like predators on the hunt. They fired relentlessly, their plasma rounds striking the asteroids with deafening cracks. Shards of rock exploded in every direction, pelting the Aegis Dawn like a relentless hailstorm. Liriel's eyes darted to the tactical display where the pursuing ships were marked in stark red. "They're adapting to your maneuvers," she warned. "Let them," Eryon muttered, his focus unbroken. As if on cue, one of the enemy ships miscalculated its trajectory, slamming into an asteroid and erupting in a blinding explosion. The shockwave rippled through the field, scattering debris and forcing the other ships to adjust. "Not so clever now, are they?" Eryon quipped, but his tone lacked humor. The ship shuddered as a plasma bolt grazed the hull, sending a shower of sparks cascading through the cockpit. Liriel winced, her gaze snapping to Eryon. That was too close. Tell me something I don't know, he shot back, his voice tight. The field began to thin, the asteroids giving way to open space. Eryon spotted an opportunity, a massive debris field left behind by an ancient battle. The wreckage of shattered ships and broken weapons floated aimlessly, their twisted forms creating a treacherous maze. "We're going in there," Eryon said, tilting the ship toward the debris field. "Are you insane?" Liriel snapped. "That place is a graveyard." "Exactly," Eryon replied. "And it's the last place they'll expect us to go." The ship plunged into the wreckage, narrowly avoiding a jagged piece of twisted metal that jutted out like a spear. The sound of scraping metal echoed through the hull as they maneuvered through the tight spaces. The Imperial ships hesitated at the edge of the field, their pilots clearly debating whether to follow. "Cowards," Eryon muttered under his breath. But Liriel wasn't convinced. Her eyes scanned the display, her instincts warning her of something more. "They're not retreating. They're regrouping." As if to confirm her suspicion, a new marker appeared on the display, larger than the others. A heavy assault cruiser, its form bristling with weaponry, emerged from the shadows. Eryon's expression darkened. "That's not good." The cruiser launched a salvo of missiles, each one glowing with an eerie green light. The missiles moved with unnatural precision, weaving through the debris with terrifying accuracy. Eryon's hands flew across the controls, activating every countermeasure the ship had. Flak cannons burst to life, filling the space around them with a storm of shrapnel. Decoy drones launched from the aft, their engines flaring as they drew the missiles off course. But it wasn't enough. One missile struck a nearby wreck, sending a shockwave that rocked the Aegis Dawn violently. Liriel was thrown off balance, her shoulder slamming against the bulkhead. Eryon glanced at her, his voice sharp. "You okay?" "I've been through worse," she muttered, pushing herself upright. The cruiser loomed closer, its weapons charging for another volley. Eryon's mind raced, calculating their odds. They were slim. "We can't fight that thing," he admitted, his tone grim. "Then what's the plan?" Liriel demanded. Eryon's eyes narrowed. "We lead them into their own trap." He adjusted their trajectory, aiming for the densest part of the debris field. Liriel's gaze flicked to the display, where the chaotic tangle of wreckage seemed almost impenetrable. "You're betting everything on that?" she asked, her voice low. Eryon's expression hardened. "It's not a bet. It's strategy." As the Aegis Dawn dove deeper into the wreckage, the Imperial cruiser followed, its weapons lighting up the darkness. But in their pursuit, the enemy failed to notice the unstable munitions scattered among the debris. Ancient mines, long dormant, but still volatile. Eryon fired a single shot from the ship's rear turret, striking one of the mines. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, setting off a chain reaction that tore through the field. The cruiser was caught in the blast, its hull crumpling under the force. As the wreckage settled, Eryon let out a slow breath, his hands trembling slightly. "That was reckless," Liriel said, her tone a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. "It worked, didn't it?" Eryon replied, his voice weary. Liriel didn't argue. Instead, she stared out the viewport, her expression unreadable. Somewhere in the wreckage, answers awaited them. But so did more questions. The Aegis Dawn glided into the canyon like a shadow slipping between the folds of twilight. Below, jagged cliffs rose on either side, their surfaces scarred by centuries of erosion and forgotten battles. Pale light filtered through the planet's dense atmosphere, casting an eerie glow over the terrain. The silence outside was haunting, broken only by the occasional crackle of magnetic storms in the distance. Inside the cockpit, Eryon leaned back in his seat, his knuckles white against the controls. He exhaled slowly, the tension from their escape still coiled tightly in his chest. "Is this it?" Liriel's voice was low but carried an edge of skepticism. She stood behind him, her arms crossed, her sharp gaze sweeping over the heads-up display that mapped the terrain ahead. "This is it," Eryon replied, his tone clipped. "The outpost is buried beneath that ridge. No signals, no life forms, just dead rock to anyone scanning from orbit. And yet you trust it to keep us hidden?" Liriel's skepticism deepened, her tone as sharp as the wind outside. "It's kept me alive this long," Eryon shot back, If you have a better option, now's the time to share." She didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. As the ship settled onto the rocky ground, the landing gears creaked against the uneven surface. Eryon powered down the engines, the vibrations fading into stillness. The sudden quiet was unnerving, like the pause before a predator's strike. "Stay close," Eryon said, rising from his seat. He strapped on a lightweight utility belt, his disruptor secured at his side. "This place isn't exactly welcoming." Girath appeared at the entrance to the cockpit, his wide eyes darting nervously between Eryon and Liriel. "What kind of not welcoming are we talking about?" "Let's hope we don't find out," Eryon muttered, motioning for them to follow. The ramp lowered with a hiss, and the trio stepped out onto the rocky terrain. The air was cold and thin, carrying a faint metallic bite that stung the back of their throats. Wind howled through the canyon, its mournful wail echoing off the cliffs. Eryon led them toward a jagged outcrop, where a narrow fissure split the rock face. The opening was barely wide enough to pass through, its edges sharp and uninviting. Liriel hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "This is your safe haven?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "It's what's behind the door that matters," Eryon replied. He placed his hand on a concealed panel near the fissure, its surface smooth and almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. A faint glow emanated from beneath his palm as the system scanned his biometrics. The rock shifted with a deep groan, revealing a hidden entrance that descended into darkness. A cold draft spilled out, carrying the faint scent of machinery and damp stone. "After you," Eryon said, his tone dry as he gestured for them to enter. The corridor inside was narrow and dimly lit, the walls rough and uneven as if carved hastily by desperate hands. The air grew heavier as they descended, the faint hum of automated systems the only indication of life. As they reached the base of the passage, the space opened into a large chamber. The walls were lined with outdated consoles and heads-up displays that flickered with intermittent data streams. The room was cluttered with crates, discarded equipment, and faintly glowing canisters. "This doesn't look like much of an outpost," Liriel remarked, her voice echoing faintly in the cavernous space. "It's not about appearances," Eryon said, moving to one of the displays. He tapped a series of commands into the console, and a map of the local star systems flickered into view. "This place is a vault. Data, weapons, tech, all the things the Empire doesn't want anyone else to have." Girath hovered near one of the consoles, his fingers twitching with curiosity. "Who built this?" "People who knew how to disappear," Eryon replied, his tone evasive. Liriel stepped closer to the map, her eyes narrowing as she studied the intricate web of systems and coordinates. "You've been running operations out of here, alone?" "Someone has to keep the fight alive," Eryon said, his voice steady. Liriel's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. "And yet you dragged me into this. Why?" Eryon turned to face her, his gray eyes hard. "Because you're the only one who can do what needs to be done. You have a name, a history, things people will follow. That makes you dangerous to the Empire." "Or to you," Liriel countered, her voice low. Before Eryon could respond, an alert blared from one of the consoles. The display shifted, revealing a series of intercepted transmissions. Lines of alien text scrolled across the screen, their meaning clear despite the cryptic language. "They found us," Girath said, his voice trembling. Eryon's jaw tightened as he studied the data. "Not yet, but they're close." Liriel's expression hardened, her gaze sharp. "How long do we have?" "Hours," Eryon replied. "Maybe less." Liriel stepped closer to the console, her violet eyes scanning the data with practiced precision. "Then we don't have time to waste. If Vorrak's forces reach this place, we're finished." Eryon nodded, his mind racing. "We need to move the data, destroy what we can't carry." "And then?" Liriel asked, her tone challenging. Eryon's gaze met hers, unflinching. "Then we make them regret finding us." The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of their predicament settling heavily over them. Liriel turned to Girath, her voice steady but firm. "Help him with the data. I'll secure the entrance." Girath hesitated, his wide eyes darting between them. "What if they break through? Then we fight," Liriel said simply. As the two men set to work, Liriel moved to the entrance, her movements deliberate and purposeful. She stood at the threshold, her gaze fixed on the dark corridor beyond. The faint sound of the wind outside was the only indication of the world they had left behind. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. It was a burden she had once carried with pride, but now it felt different, heavier, more fragile. Her thoughts were interrupted by Eryon's voice. "Liriel." She turned to see him standing a few steps away, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "We'll make it through this," he said quietly. She studied him for a moment, her expression guarded. "You seem awfully sure of that." Eryon's smirk returned, faint but genuine. "Call it strategy." For the first time since they'd met, Liriel allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, their dark tendrils twisting through the canyon like harbingers of what was to come. Somewhere in the shadows, Vorrak's forces were closing in, and the fight for survival was about to begin. The console blinked erratically as Eryon's fingers moved over it, transferring encrypted data to portable drives. The dim light in the cavern flickered as if the facility itself was holding its breath, mirroring the tension in the air. Jirath worked silently beside him, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands trembling as they clutched a storage module. "They're accelerating," Jirath whispered, glancing nervously at the display. The laser plasma screen glowed with red indicators, enemy ships closing in on their position. "How can they be moving this fast?" "They must have triangulated the energy signature of the vault systems," Eryon said, his voice low and grim. "We're running out of time. Focus." Liriel stood at the threshold of the vault, her silhouette stark against the pale, shifting light filtering through the canyon above. She stared into the dark corridor that led back to the surface, listening intently. Her pulse quickened as the faint sound of heavy footfalls echoed through the tunnel, calculated, deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. "They're here," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Eryon didn't look up from the console. "How many?" "Enough to make this a bad day," Liriel replied, her tone dry but edged with urgency. She turned to face him fully. "What's the plan?" Eryon pulled the final drive from the console, the device warm in his hands. He slipped it into his belt pouch and rose to his full height, his gaze hard as steel. "We split them up. Draw them away from the vault. The longer we keep them guessing, the better our odds." Liriel crossed her arms, her violet eyes narrowing. "And if they're not in the mood to be distracted?" "Then we improvise," Eryon said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really think that'll work?" Jirath asked, his voice trembling as he clutched the storage module to his chest like a lifeline. "It has to," Eryon replied. The ground beneath them shuddered, sending a cascade of loose rock tumbling from the cavern walls. Liriel's gaze darted upward, and her jaw tightened. "We don't have time to debate. Let's move." Eryon nodded, motioning for Jirath to follow. "Stick close, and don't do anything stupid." The group ascended the narrow passageway, the oppressive weight of the encroaching enemy pressing down on them like a physical force. The walls seemed to close in as the light dimmed and the air grew heavier with each step. As they reached the surface, the sight that greeted them was worse than Eryon had anticipated. Dozens of Imperial troops moved with military precision across the rocky terrain, their black armor gleaming under the stormy sky. Their weapons glowed faintly with an unnatural energy, and their movements were methodical, like a swarm of mechanical insects closing in for the kill. Liriel's breath hitched, but she steadied herself, gripping the hilt of the blade she had taken from the vault's armory. "They've come prepared," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "They always do," Eryon muttered. He scanned the area, his mind racing. His gaze landed on a series of jagged rock formations to their left. "We use the terrain. Force them to split up. Liriel, take Jirath and head toward that ridge. I'll draw their attention from the other side." Liriel's eyes narrowed. "You're going to make yourself a target?" "Better me than the two of you," Eryon replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Girath opened his mouth to protest, but Liriel cut him off with a sharp glance. "You heard him. Let's go." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Girath by the arm and pulled him toward the ridge. Eryon watched them for a moment before turning his attention back to the advancing troops. He activated a small device on his wrist, and a bright flare shot into the air, arcing high above the canyon before exploding in a dazzling burst of light. The Imperial forces immediately shifted their focus, their formation rippling as they turned toward the source of the distraction. Eryon smirked to himself, his pulse steady despite the danger. "Come and get me." He darted toward the rock formations, his movements quick and deliberate. The rough terrain tore at his boots, and the bitter wind stung his face, but he pressed on, weaving through the jagged landscape with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime running from danger. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The Imperial troops moved with unsettling precision, their boots striking the ground in perfect unison. Eryon glanced over his shoulder and saw them closing the distance, their weapons raised and ready. He reached a narrow crevice between two massive boulders and slipped inside, pressing his back against the cold stone. His breathing was shallow, his senses heightened as he listened for the approaching soldiers. The faint hum of their weapons grew louder, the sound reverberating through the tight space like a sinister heartbeat. Eryon's fingers tightened around the disruptor at his side. He waited until the first soldier passed by the entrance to the crevice, then stepped out, his movements swift and silent. The disruptor fired with a sharp hiss, the beam striking the soldier squarely in the chest. The trooper collapsed without a sound, his armor smoking where the beam had hit. Before the others could react, Eryon ducked back into the crevice, his heart pounding. He could hear their voices now, sharp and clipped, barking orders in a guttural alien tongue. "Keep looking," one of them growled. "He's close." Eryon's jaw tightened as he calculated his next move. He couldn't afford to stay here for long. The longer he waited, the more likely they were to find Liriel and Girath. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the crevice. His disruptor raised. The soldiers turned toward him, their weapons firing in unison. Eryon dove behind a nearby boulder, the plasma bolt striking the ground around him with explosive force. "Is that all you've got?" he muttered under his breath, a wry grin tugging at his lips. He activated another device on his belt, and a small drone launched into the air, its sleek form zipping toward the soldiers with startling speed. The drone emitted a high-pitched whine before detonating in a burst of blinding light and concussive force. The soldiers staggered, their formation breaking as they tried to recover. Eryon seized the opportunity, slipping away through the maze of rocks. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever, but if he could buy Liriel and Girath enough time to reach the fallback point, it would be worth it. As he moved deeper into the canyon, the sound of pursuit began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. Eryon's steps slowed, his instincts prickling. Something wasn't right. He reached for his communicator and activated the channel. "Liriel, report. Are you clear?" There was a long pause, and then her voice came through, low and tense. "We've reached the ridge, but something's wrong. They're not following us anymore." Eryon's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Before she could respond, a new voice crackled through the channel, a voice Eryon hadn't heard in years. "Well, well," it drawled, dripping with mockery. "Still playing the hero, Fallos?" Eryon's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice immediately. It was General Iskar Vren, the man who had betrayed the resistance. "What are you doing here, Vren?" Eryon demanded, his voice low and dangerous. A sinister laugh echoed through the channel. "Did you really think you could outmaneuver me? You've walked right into my trap." Eryon's jaw tightened, his mind racing as the weight of Vren's words sank in. He glanced back toward the direction of the vault, dread settling like a stone in his chest. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was strategic, and it wasn't over yet. The cold silence that followed Vren's mocking voice seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the faint crackle of static over the communicator. Eryon's hand hovered near the disruptor at his side, his pulse pounding as his mind raced to decipher the depths of the betrayal. "You've overplayed your hand, Vren," Eryon said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Vren's laugh came again, hollow and taunting. "Oh, Fallos, you always were too optimistic for your own good. Did you think you could play your games without drawing attention? We've been watching you, waiting for you to make a move. And now, you've handed me the queen." Eryon's knuckles whitened as he gripped the communicator. "You've aligned yourself with the Empire? I underestimated your cowardice." "It's not cowardice," Vren replied smoothly, his tone brimming with confidence. "It's survival. You, of all people, should understand that. I'm securing my future in a galaxy that will bow to the Empire, not fight it." Eryon turned sharply, his boots grinding against the uneven ground as he scanned the horizon. His thoughts snapped to Liriel and Jireth. "If you've harmed them, they're alive for now," Vren interrupted. "The queen is far too valuable to kill. But her little pet? I'm not so sure." Static replaced the voice, leaving Eryon alone in the eerie quiet of the canyon. He inhaled deeply, the cool air carrying the faint tang of scorched earth from his earlier skirmish. The shadows stretched longer now as the sun dipped lower, casting an unsettling orange glow across the jagged rocks. He activated his communicator again, his tone urgent. "Liriel, can you hear me? Report." There was a pause, then Liriel's voice, sharp and controlled. "We've been spotted. Jirath's injured, but we're holding them off for now. What's happening?" "Vren's here. It's a trap," Eryon said tersely. A brief silence followed, then Liriel's tone hardened. "We're not running, Fallos. Whatever game he's playing, it ends here." "Agreed," Eryon replied. He adjusted his disruptor and started toward the ridge. "Hold your position. I'm on my way." As he moved, the ground beneath him felt unsteady, the jagged terrain forcing him to watch each step. The canyon walls loomed like sentinels, their cracked surfaces whispering stories of old battles. The air grew colder, biting at his exposed skin, carrying the faint metallic tang of impending danger. Eryon's mind raced as he pieced together the situation. Vren wasn't here for glory or vengeance. He wanted something far worse. The data they'd taken from the vault held critical intelligence, and Liriel herself was the key to rallying the resistance. If Vren delivered her to the Empire, it would crush what little hope remained. The faint sound of blaster fire cut through the stillness, sharp and erratic. Eryon quickened his pace, his boots crunching against loose gravel. As he crested the ridge, the scene unfolded before him in a chaotic tableau. Liriel stood defiantly at the edge of a rocky outcrop, her blade gleaming with a faint blue hue as it caught the dying sunlight. Her movements were fluid, yet deliberate, each strike a deadly arc as she fended off 3 armored soldiers. Their attacks were relentless, plasma bolts scorching the air around her, but she moved with a grace that belied her earlier skepticism of her own abilities. Jirath crouched behind a jagged boulder, his face pale and twisted in pain as he clutched a wounded leg. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage he'd hastily tied, the crimson stain stark against the gray stone. Eryon took aim and fired, his disruptor's blast striking one of the soldiers squarely in the back. The figure crumpled instantly, and the remaining 2 turned toward him, their weapons raised. "You're late," Liriel said, her voice carrying over the din as she spun to deliver a lethal blow to another soldier. "Had to make an entrance," Eryon replied, his tone dry but tinged with urgency. The final soldier hesitated, their weapon wavering as they glanced between the 2 humans and Liriel. Before they could act, Liriel lunged forward, her blade piercing their chest. The soldier collapsed with a metallic thud, their helmet rolling away to reveal lifeless, reptilian features. Eryon crossed the distance to Jirath, kneeling beside him. "How bad is it?" Jirath winced, his voice strained. "I'll live. Probably." "Good enough," Eryon said, pulling a stim pack from his belt and injecting it into Jirath's leg. The young alien hissed in pain, but the bleeding slowed and his breathing steadied. Liriel approached, wiping her blade clean against the edge of her sleeve. "They were scouts," she said, her tone grim. "Vren's main force is close." Eryon nodded, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The faint glint of metal in the distance caught his eye, shadows shifting against the growing darkness. "They're boxing us in." "Then we break the box," Liriel said, her voice firm. Eryon glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a faint smile. I hope you've got a plan, Your Majesty. Her expression didn't falter. You're the tactician. I'm just here to make sure we survive. The sound of approaching engines, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground, grew louder. Eryon's eyes narrowed as he spotted the source, a line of armored transports flanked by smaller, heavily armed craft. Vren always did like theatrics, Eryon muttered. Liriel's grip tightened on her blade. We can't outrun that. We're not going to, Eryon said, his voice steady, but we can make sure they regret finding us. He turned to Jerath, his tone softening. You good to move? Jerath nodded, his jaw set despite the pain. I'll manage. Eryon activated his wrist display, the laser plasma screen flickering to life. A map of the canyon appeared, highlighting a narrow passageway leading to a series of concealed mines they'd placed earlier. We lure them in here, Eryon said, pointing to the passage. Once they're committed, we trigger the explosives and collapse the canyon. Liriel frowned. And if they don't follow us? They will, Eryon said, his confidence unwavering. Vren won't let you escape, not now. The plan was risky, borderline suicidal, but it was their only chance. Eryon glanced at Liriel, meeting her gaze. You up for this? She smirked faintly, her violet eyes gleaming. You keep asking questions you already know the answer to. Together they moved toward the narrow passage, their steps deliberate but swift. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing heavier with each step. As the sound of Vren's forces grew louder, Eryon placed his hand on the first detonator, his pulse steady despite the chaos around him. He glanced at Liriel, her blade at the ready, and Jerath, his face pale but resolute. On my mark, Eryon said, his voice steady. The shadows ahead shifted as Vren's forces entered the canyon, their movements confident, their weapons gleaming in the low light. Eryon's jaw tightened as he whispered, Now. The detonator clicked and the world erupted in fire and stone. The explosion ripped through the canyon like a deafening roar, sending jagged shards of rock and debris cascading in every direction. Eryon crouched low against the ground, his arm shielding his face as a wave of searing heat and dust surged past him. The blast illuminated the jagged walls of the canyon in fiery bursts, casting fleeting, grotesque shadows of Vren's soldiers as they were swallowed by the collapsing terrain. When the initial shock subsided, Eryon opened his eyes, blinking against the haze of smoke and rubble that hung thick in the air. The acrid taste of pulverized stone clung to the back of his throat, and his ears rang with the echoes of destruction. Slowly, he pushed himself upright and scanned the narrow gorge ahead. It was a scene of chaos. The path Vren's forces had marched through moments earlier was now a churning sea of debris, their transports crushed beneath fallen boulders. The remaining soldiers, scattered and disoriented, stumbled through the wreckage, their weapons drawn, but their focus fractured. Did it work? Liriel's voice cut through the haze, sharp and steady. Eryon turned to find her standing nearby, her face streaked with dirt, but her posture unyielding. Behind her, Jerath leaned heavily against a jagged rock, his leg still bandaged and his expression taut with pain. Not completely, Eryon said, his gaze fixed on the soldiers regrouping amid the rubble. They're not done yet. Liriel followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as she took in the enemy's movements. They've lost their advantage, at least. If we press them now, we can take them out before Vren gets here. Eryon finished, his mind already calculating the next steps. Liriel nodded, her grip tightening on her blade. What's the play? Eryon knelt and activated his wrist display, the glowing heads-up map overlaying the terrain in front of them. He pointed to a series of natural choke points created by the explosion. We split up, he said, his tone crisp. Liriel, you take the high ground. Use the ledges to pick them off one by one. Jerath and I will push through the center and keep them distracted. Jerath grimaced but nodded, his voice strained. I can still shoot. Good, Eryon said. We'll need every advantage we can get. Stick to cover, don't engage unless you're sure, and above all, keep moving. We can't let them pin us down. Liriel hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning Eryon's face. "You're sure about this?" "Do you have a better idea?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. She didn't reply, but the faintest flicker of a smirk crossed her lips. "Just don't die, tactician. You're still useful." With that, she turned and moved swiftly toward the nearest outcrop, her lithe form disappearing into the shadows above. Eryon motioned to Jareth, who adjusted his grip on the lightweight plasma rifle slung across his shoulder. "Stay close and cover my flank," Eryon said. The two of them advanced cautiously, weaving through the jagged remains of the canyon. The air buzzed with tension, every sound magnified. The scrape of boots against stone, the hiss of plasma weapons charging, the ragged breaths of soldiers still alive but shaken. Eryon spotted movement ahead, a trio of soldiers picking their way through the rubble, their weapons raised and their armor glinting faintly in the dim light. He held up a hand, signaling Jareth to stop. "3 targets," Eryon whispered, his voice low. "Take the one on the left. I've got the center." Jareth nodded, raising his rifle with a trembling but determined grip. Eryon waited for the perfect moment, his heart steady as a drumbeat. Then with a sharp gesture, he and Jareth opened fire. The plasma bolts streaked through the air, striking their marks with deadly accuracy. 2 soldiers fell instantly, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The third spun toward them, his weapon charging, but a sudden blur of motion from above ended his life. Liriel landed behind him, her blade slicing cleanly through his armor before he could react. Eryon exhaled and gave her a curt nod as she vanished back into the shadows. They pressed forward, their movements deliberate but swift. The enemy's cohesion was unraveling, their formations breaking down as Liriel's strikes sowed chaos from above. Eryon and Jareth took advantage of every distraction, cutting through the disoriented soldiers with calculated efficiency. But the deeper they pushed, the clearer it became that Vren wasn't relying solely on foot soldiers. A low rumble echoed through the canyon, followed by the unmistakable clank of mechanized legs. Eryon froze, his stomach knotting as a massive warmech emerged from the smoke. Its towering frame bristled with weapons, and its cold, glowing eyes scanned the battlefield like a predator searching for prey. "Of course he brought a mech," Eryon muttered under his breath. Jareth's face paled. "What do we do now?" "Keep it busy," Eryon said, his tone grim. "Liriel will have to take it down from above." He raised his disruptor and fired, the beam striking the mech's armor with a burst of sparks but doing little damage. The machine's gaze snapped to them, and a barrage of plasma rounds rained down, forcing them to dive for cover. Liriel's voice crackled through the communicator. "I see it. Keep it distracted. I'll handle the rest." Eryon didn't question her. He emerged from cover and fired again, his shots aimed at the mech's legs. The machine turned its full attention to him, its weapons swiveling to track his movements. "Over here, you oversized junk heap!" Eryon shouted, darting to the side as the mech's cannons roared. Jareth joined in, his shots more frantic but no less effective at keeping the mech off balance. High above, Liriel moved with silent precision, her form barely visible against the jagged cliffs. She reached a narrow ledge directly above the mech and crouched, her blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. "On my mark," she said over the communicator. Eryon gritted his teeth and fired again, the disruptor overheating in his hands. The mech's movements became erratic, its legs shifting as it struggled to target both him and Jareth. "Now!" Liriel's voice rang out. She leapt from the ledge, her blade angled downward as she descended toward the mech. The weapon pierced the machine's armor with a deafening screech, sparks erupting in every direction. Liriel clung to the mech's back, driving the blade deeper as the machine thrashed violently. "Fallos!" she shouted. Eryon didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and fired a final shot, striking the mech's exposed core. The machine convulsed, its movements jerky and uncontrolled, before collapsing in a heap of sparking metal. Liriel jumped clear just before it hit the ground, landing in a crouch beside Eryon. "Nice timing," she said, her breathing heavy but steady. "You're welcome," Eryon replied, his tone dry. The battlefield fell eerily silent, the remaining soldiers retreating into the shadows, but Eryon knew the fight wasn't over. "This was just the opening act," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Liriel nodded, her expression unreadable. And Vren is waiting for the finale. Eryon crouched at the edge of the ridge, his eyes fixed on the massive Imperial command vessel hovering in the distance, like a dark omen. Its angular design bristled with weaponry, each turret and cannon gleaming under the pale glow of the fractured sky. The once quiet canyon was now a battlefield, littered with the remains of soldiers and machinery. The air buzzed with the tension of a final confrontation that could not be avoided. Liriel stood beside him, her blade sheathed at her side, her violet eyes locked on the command vessel. Her shoulders were square, her stance steady, but there was a quiet storm in her gaze. "Vren is in there," she said, her voice low but resolute, "and he'll have reinforcements." Eryon nodded, his jaw tightening. "This isn't about reinforcements anymore. This is about finishing it." He glanced at Jirath, who was crouched behind a nearby rock, his plasma rifle cradled in his lap. Despite the exhaustion etched into his features, the young alien's resolve was unshaken. "What's the plan?" Liriel asked, breaking the silence. Eryon exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "We take out the command vessel. If we destroy it, Vren loses his coordination. His forces will crumble without centralized control." "That ship is a fortress," Liriel said, her tone sharp. "You're talking about storming the heart of his operation with just the three of us." "Four," Jirath interjected, his voice steady despite the strain. Eryon smirked faintly, though his eyes remained on the distant vessel. "Reckless plans are my specialty." Liriel's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it was fleeting. "Then let's make it count." The trek toward the command vessel was slow and deliberate, each step taken with care to avoid detection. The closer they drew, the more imposing it became, a monolithic structure that seemed to devour the light around it. The faint hum of its reactor was a low vibration under their feet, a reminder of the raw power it contained. Eryon motioned for them to stop as they reached the edge of the vessel's docking platform. He pointed toward the access hatch at its base, partially concealed by crates of supplies and patrolling guards. "Jirath, you stay here and cover us," Eryon said, his tone firm. "Liriel and I will handle the rest." Jirath nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Don't worry about me. Just make sure you finish this." Eryon turned to Liriel, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. "Ready?" Her hand rested on the hilt of her blade. "Always." They moved as one, slipping past the guards with practiced ease. The sound of boots against metal grated faintly in the background as they approached the access hatch. Eryon knelt and began working on the control panel, his hands deftly bypassing the security systems. "You've done this before," Liriel remarked, her voice barely above a whisper. "More times than I'd like to admit," Eryon replied, his tone clipped. The hatch hissed open, and they slipped inside, the cold metallic walls of the corridor swallowing them whole. The interior of the vessel was a labyrinth of shadowed hallways and flickering displays. The air carried the faint tang of machinery and something sharper, an almost electric taste that clung to the back of the throat. Each step they took echoed faintly, their breaths barely audible over the soft hum of the ship's systems. Eryon's wrist display projected a map of the vessel, its laser plasma grid highlighting their path to the command center. "We need to move fast," he said. "Vren knows we're coming." "Let him," Liriel said, her voice steely. As they approached the command center, the air grew heavier, a palpable tension pressing down on them. The doors slid open with a sharp hiss, revealing a wide chamber bathed in crimson light. At its center stood Vren, his imposing figure framed by the massive heads-up displays that flickered with tactical data. "So predictable," Vren said, his voice smooth and taunting. He turned to face them, his armor gleaming like dark obsidian. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Fallos." "Vren," Eryon said, his tone cold, "this ends here." Vren laughed, the sound echoing ominously through the chamber. "You think you've won? Even if you kill me, the Empire will endure. You're nothing but a fleeting nuisance." Liriel stepped forward, her blade drawn, her gaze locked on Vren. "You betrayed your people. You turned your back on everything you once stood for." "I adapted," Vren snapped, his voice sharp. "Survival means knowing when to choose the winning side." Eryon's hand hovered over his disruptor. "Survival isn't worth losing your soul." Vren's eyes narrowed and his hand moved to the control panel beside him. "You're too late," he said. "This ship is armed with enough firepower to wipe out every resistant stronghold in this sector. Even if you destroy me, I've already won." Eryon exchanged a glance with Liriel. "Then we destroy the ship," he said. Vren smirked, his confidence unwavering. "You'll never make it out alive." "We don't need to," Liriel said, her voice calm but laced with fire. The room erupted into chaos as Vren lunged toward them, his weapon drawn. Eryon fired his disruptor, the shot grazing Vren's armor but failing to stop him. Liriel moved with deadly precision, her blade clashing against Vren's in a shower of sparks. Eryon darted to the control panel, his fingers moving swiftly over the keys. The ship's displays shifted, alarms blaring, as he initiated the overload sequence for the reactor. "What are you doing?" Vren roared, his voice filled with rage as he struggled against Liriel's relentless assault. "Making sure you don't get your victory," Eryon said, his tone cold. Vren pushed Liriel back with a sudden burst of strength, his eyes wild with fury. "You'll kill us all." "That's the idea," Eryon said, his smirk faint but sharp. Liriel regained her footing and struck again, her blade finding its mark. Vren staggered, blood seeping from the wound as he fell to his knees. "You could have been a hero," Eryon said, his voice quiet but firm. Vren's eyes flickered with something, regret perhaps, before they closed for the last time. The ship trembled as the reactor's overload sequence reached its final stages. Eryon turned to Liriel, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared resolve. "Go," she said, her voice steady. "I'll hold them off." Eryon hesitated, his heart clenching. "Liriel, go!" she shouted, her blade raised as more soldiers poured into the chamber. Eryon turned and ran, the corridor blurring around him as he reached the escape pod bay. Jirith was already inside, his eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. "Where's Liriel?" Jirith asked. Eryon didn't answer. He activated the pod, the door sealing behind him as the ship's systems groaned under the strain of the reactor's collapse. The pod launched just as the command vessel erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave tearing through the sky. Eryon stared out the viewport, his chest tight. He didn't speak, didn't move, but deep in his heart he knew Liriel's sacrifice had given them a chance. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a fragile thing. It felt real, and it was worth everything.